Hi, I'm Bruce Lynch. Welcome to my channel. I didn't do the disclaimer in the last video. That was a goof in the B001. So the concepts and methods presented here are my own original work, unless otherwise cited. I am not a licensed professional in any capacity. These are simply the tools I've developed and used to navigate my own life and circumstances. Any meaning, value, or application this work holds for you is entirely yours to determine. So, a little bit more context in what led to developing the inventory. This video is about developing the inventory. So when I was trying to grapple with what sanity and insanity might mean, but I did not have the luxury of existing context because that never came back. And I no longer had the mental health world to tell me what it was. And I didn't have a way to apply the 12 steps to tell me what it was. Even though I've been sober a long time, 12-step recovery is very clear linguistically. Powerless over fill in the blank, and my life has become unmanageable. I had to admit we were powerless over whatever. And for me, because I didn't have a natural relationship with language and context, I felt like I would be living a dishonest program if I couldn't name it, fill in the blank. And literally, if I couldn't do it, I felt like I was lying. And because honesty was part of everything about recovery that I had been taught, I couldn't proceed. It didn't feel safe to, proceed. And mind you, up to this point, I had 16 years of recovery, active recovery, in various 12-step rooms, working the steps around alcohol, drugs, codependence, even what else did I do? Emotions and Al-Anon, so more other codependence program, and even some of the MICA, which actually came into existence after I got sober, used to be dual recovery or special interest thing. But in any case, I couldn't fill in the blanks, like algebraically, which is the only, like a formal structure was what I thought was required in order to participate linguistically with the people in the rooms. What good does it do to have a program that's about we if I don't have words to be able to interact with the people that I could understand? So I didn't know how to fill in that blank, but I had a lot of experience with the steps. I'd done the steps in depth very carefully lots of times. And the steps had given me a practice to look at situations in my own life and consciousness that I had not known how to face and would not have had any kind of scaffolding to keep me steady while I questioned these things in myself and looked at them. And the 12-step inventory had been key to all of that. So in traditional Alcoholics Anonymous, the fourth step is the inventory, and it's made a searching, fearless, moral inventory of ourselves. Now, because of that and how it's laid out in Big Book and other fellowships, there's a sort of chart, at least in the most used one. I know Dr. Bob has his different one, and there's Joe and Charlie shapes and different things, and different fellowships had different things and work with it. The basic thing was like a chart, laying out what the resentment was about, who it was about, what happened, and what my part was, and then what parts were affected. And then there's one on fear, there's one on sex. So the part that was interesting about it was is that it isolated experiences in a way that made them lists rather than reliving. And so I don't have an innate relationship with the meaning of words. I only have a functional one. And so when I couldn't figure out how to, like I had inside whatever was different about me. And part of it was never having really understood how I could process so fast when I was little. Never having understood why I couldn't really make friends very easily, why I couldn't understand social situations, why it irritated me if people did not speak consistently, why if they lied to me, I would never trust them again. Why I had a hard time reading facial expressions and social cues, and I couldn't interact socially. I didn't feel like I could make effective friendships unless I was high, and then I could make friendships much better. Um, and so I never understood those things. I felt there was something that must be deeply wrong with me. In fact, before I fell, I started drinking and smoking when I was 11. And by the time I was 15, I had graduated into heavy pot use. By the time I was 16 and 17, I was into LSD and Valium and other things. They lasted longer. I tried Coke, but it was like for a minute, really expensive. Didn't seem very cost effective. But shrooms, hash, all these kinds of things, they were lovely to me. So I tripped hundreds of times. And and I drank a lot, like a fish. And so the reason that I mean, partly it gave me a break from being unable to have any peace or safety in my life. No relationships at home. It was a shit show because mom went crazy after dad died and came home and stayed crazy and drank and raged, and that was our life. And so, my sisters took off. It was me and my little brother. He had his thing. And so, and I, I'd been raped by an older boy, and I was being bullied at school by some of the jocks and stuff when they realized I was gay. It didn't go well in the 80s in a small town. So, I I liked the break that recreational chemistry gave me from the pain. It never resolved anything, of course. Um, but I also, it was my hope as I explored it that just like the ECTs would later when they suggested them, if I used fast enough and hard enough, I might accidentally overdose and kill what part of my brain was defective. And then I reasoned that logically I would just reconstruct a new consciousness or personality inside the ruin of it. And if I got killed in the overdose, well, that wasn't going to be any loss to anybody anyway. People didn't even know I was there. I would disappear and nobody would know I had ever existed because people didn't interact with me growing up until I was about probably my sophomore, junior year. When I became fully immersed in drugs, then I became part of the people that did drugs, which cared less about the social norms, and so I began having social relationships. But until then, I didn't really have any part of the social world. I could learn very quickly. But because I could learn, I was never a behavior problem, and teachers didn't notice me. Administrators didn't notice me. I got to college level and had to choose my own colleges and career plans because no guidance counselor took me into their office at any point and asked me what I wanted to do with my life. It was an oversight, and because no one had ever offered help before, I didn't know that I should be asking for it. I assumed it was my job to figure it out, so I just figured out everything alone. So if I got killed in the overdose, it wasn't going to be any loss. Nobody's going to even notice. I wouldn't mind because I didn't have a working life anyway. So that was how drugs and alcohol were for me. So I got into the recovery and had to grapple with recreational chemistry. And then I used the inventory when I wanted to get sober. I wanted to figure out how to live my life in a way that could at least deal with experiences that happened without freaking out. And it was when I decidedly wanted to do that and without means we wanted to go back to recreational chemistry, I realized that I had developed into a problem. But it was a problem that I couldn't solve with understanding because the understanding was the problem. The understanding had become alcoholic and addicted. So when I moved fast forward, whatever crazy part that was in me was still there. I didn't know that it was not crazy. I didn't know that it was a neurological difference and that it was healthy for me and just hadn't been properly integrated. So I felt this thing like in my chest, and it's a crazy. And that's what I was saying to myself in my living room. Okay, I've got this crazy. I've got a crazy. What is it? And when the mental health smart people told me, well, we don't know what this is, I'm like, well, you guys are the ones with the mental health doctor degrees. If you don't know, then, well, I guess it doesn't apply. And then The only other people were the addiction people, and I didn't know how to fit into their language thing. So that wasn't going to work either. And I was left with the experience that I could instinctively identify as crazy, it functioned as crazy, but I didn't know how to make use of the term. And so I thought, oh, it must be just a misunderstanding about language. And so the inventory for traditional 12-step programs gave me a structure to evaluate memories in a linear fashion without reliving them. Part of the discipline of working through a moral inventory had been the need to face some really difficult experiences and learn over time that it's possible to touch on them enough for some information without getting lost in them. And mind you, years before these inventories, part of the sex inventory, for example, had been revisiting molestation by my father before he died when I was about 7 or 8, being raped by an older boy when I was 10 or 11, like right after my dad died, and there was nobody to tell. I was raped by a woman, forced into sex when I was about 17. These things had happened, and I'd had, things that happened later on in life during drinking experiences, parties, different. It's not important. But I had to inventory these things, and so the inventory had given me the practice of being able to identify an experience enough to write it down on a list without getting lost in it. So it became a valuable resource in terms of skill. And I decided, well, I'm going to go back and evaluate the experiences in which I learned what sanity and insanity were. And I'm going to make a list of these experiences without getting lost in them. And so to give an example, I called this an anchor word. It's going to anchor my exploration of language. At the time, actually, I didn't know anchor word yet. I was still just trying to work with that one word. And so for me, it was sanity and insanity because they're two sides of the same coin. And I started making a list. I borrowed the function of 12-step inventory from Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs to create a new kind of inventory to work with memory and experience. And so I thought, what experiences did I have to struggle with the meaning of sanity and insanity? And so what came to mind first was when my mother came home from the nut house when I was like 10 or 11, after Dad died, she went away for a while. She came home and she went away again. And basically for several months, my oldest sisters took off and I was 10 and I had a little brother who was 8 and we took care of everything. We took our little wagon and we went down to the grocery store. We bought all the groceries and brought them back and did the cooking and the cleaning. We ran the household and we didn't know that people don't live that way. And so Mom came home eventually, and when it was clear she had some kind of mental illness, then for me, suddenly mental illness, which I'd learned about a little bit in school, wasn't something that I read about in books or saw in movies. It could happen to my mom. It could happen to somebody that I loved. And so that expanded what sanity and insanity could mean. So I had to take a moment with that because when the meaning of that word changed, it changed my world. And when my world changed, it changed how I felt I belonged to that world. And how I belonged changed. It felt how I felt about myself doing the belonging. And so then I realized that when the words changed, it had this domino effect that required me to update my sense of self and work out a new way of how I was going to fit into the world, a new sense of the world I was fitting into, and then a new sense of what the meaning of the words were. That was one chunk of inventory. The next one I put on the list is a couple years later, my oldest sister was diagnosed bipolar. She was like bipolar 1, so she needed lithium and rage attacks and all kinds of weird shit. When I became sexually aware and I realized I was into boys, it reminded me of being raped, and so I thought I had gone crazy. That was another experience. And I lined up these experiences. There were lots of them. When I got into college and I was a double major as math and English, and for me, math and English were the same thing, identical. They're the same active mind, just in a different classroom. Because to me, the pattern of mathematics and poetry is identical autistically. I thought I was crazy because I'm seeing something as identical that the world sees as mutually exclusive and opposite. So I put these on my list and that became my inventory. What I did with my inventory is going to be the next video. So this is just about making the inventory, adapting 12-step inventory to language box work.